Cyber has been an area of big concern for me. Thankfully, when I was deployed, I got an opportunity to manage some cyber operations, and that just opened my eyes. And then when I came back to Virginia, and these are the golden nuggets, is, managing a cyber-related event while you're managing consequences is an issue. It's a challenge, especially when IT folks don't know what emergency managers do and what they can bring to the table. The space is full of authorities and legal issues. And then, today we're talking about, critical infrastructure operators that could be private entities. So how do we as directors figure a way to provide, first, can we and how can we support our private sector owners and operators? So that's a kind of a teaser. And again, our strategy in Virginia, we want to leverage existing processes. Imagine this, we're crisis leaders sitting in the room today. We demonstrated that through COVID. So I would argue that we leverage existing processes and systems to manage a cyber-related attack on the energy sector. And I look forward to our conversations.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Brock. Mike Burke, Green Mountain Power. I think I'll throw it out there first that I've actually never worked for a man as a CEO. So our company has had 2 CEOs since I've joined the field ops leadership since 2008. And they've both been women, and they're great, and I'm happy and proud about that. So I'm here because I lead the field ops team at Green Mountain. We work through a lot of the severe weather events here in Vermont. I work directly with Director Borneman on a lot of those events. We serve 272,000 customers in Vermont, about 3/4 of the Vermont population, and we're working really hard on resiliency and looking for all the help we can get to get there. So.
Dan. Hey everyone, I'm Dan Burgess. I'm director of the Governor's Energy Office in Maine. I'm really glad to be here. Appreciate y'all inviting me. I was actually last week just at the National Association of State Energy Officials, so the version of this, but for energy officials. We had our annual meeting in Florida, and the first panel that we had there was about resiliency and about the energy system. And so I think it's a really good sign that our 2 agencies we're talking at the state level, but also the national level about how important this is. State energy offices are non-regulatory offices generally. We're not the utility commission. We are advisors to our governor, to our agencies, to our legislatures. And so we serve a critical function and a partnership opportunity, I think, for emergency management officials as conveners, as subject matter experts, as those with contacts within the energy industry. And, I think we need look no further than what's happening globally around energy issues and energy, whether it's prices or security, to know that we need to make sure that we've got open lines of communication with each other. So looking forward to the conversation. I'll say both on the electricity side, but also I'm from Maine and welcome to the Northeast, but also on the delivered fuels side as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. So to kick things off, we were also supposed to have a representative from the NERC here and the Electric Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which operates underneath the NERC, that you can become a member of and also start to understand attacks or potential attacks or threats against grids, the grid within North America from a cyber standpoint, physical attacks, and these are things that I've learned about, since leaving FEMA. But I think it's important to highlight why this session is important. We've seen grid attacks, state-sponsored grid attacks across the globe. Particularly, we're watching Russia and Ukraine play out right now. And while that's not here, there are definitely cyber attacks that take place and threats that come our way. But we've also seen Mother Nature knock out 2 grids. We saw it knock out Puerto Rico, and we saw it knock out Texas when everybody decided to plug in their portable heaters all at the same time. And so the bottom line is it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. We're going to see different grid failures, particularly as threats evolve, down the road. And the question is, and one of the things that I saw, during my time in office with back-to-back billion-dollar disasters, Harvey, Irma, Maria, the wildfires, massive events that were taking place, is that I started to recognize that as a profession, we put such a focus on incident command, and that was born out of 9/11 and Katrina and everything else. But I started to ask the question of, are we truly the incident commander over the infrastructure that's owned by the private sector, or are we a coordinator that can help them keep their infrastructure up? And so that was kind of where, Lifelines were born, of recognizing, what's got to be working in your community, that if it's not working, then people are dying or life routine is disrupted. And all of you as a state director ought to be asking that in your state. And if you identify those things, then you ought to be mitigating them and working with them. But more importantly, finding out who owns that infrastructure and asking them, how can we rewrite our response plans and our tactics to help you if it hits the fan, right? And so obviously power and fuel is the major lifeline that impacts all the rest of the infrastructure. And I've often thought that as emergency managers, if we know that power and fuel has got to be working so that all the other infrastructure can work, then we need to be coordinating our ESFs, very closely on the preparedness side, the response side, the recovery side, helping the private industry. And we've got to figure out, how the federal government, how the state governments and local governments can provide support, to private entities that really make your communities work. And, and I saw some things. I witnessed some things where, some of our response tactics were actually probably keeping the lights off and the comms down longer than they should have. Starting with first push debris. We shoved debris out of the way without really thinking about what we're putting it in front of. Are we blocking access to energy companies? Are we blocking access to the telecommunications companies? Are we really sitting down in that EOC with the energy providers and the fuel providers of saying, are we doing this correctly? How can we do debris in the first push or secondary push to really help you, to be able to gain access, right? The other thing, too, is that in 2018, and please be honest about this, how many of you have heard of the FAST Act? The FAST Act created a grid security declaration, grid security emergency. How many of you have heard of a grid security emergency declaration?
Couple.
There's a new disaster declaration, presidential disaster declaration, called a grid security emergency that empowers the Secretary of the Department of Energy to be able to really provide orders down through our nation that dictates how power will be restored. And guess what? You're not at the table on this discussion. And so in some cases, if a grid security, if we see an attack, from a cyber attack, physical attack, whatever it may be, and a huge portion of the grid goes down, the restoration priorities right now would be made largely without your influence as a state director or local director. And when you start to see those priorities take place, and what played out in Grid X6 was how DOD is going to be the priority and not your hospitals. So when these things occur, quite frankly, I think that the emergency management community has got to do a much better job of inserting itself into these conversations coming forward and helping to shape future disaster declarations. The other thing that with Administrator Criswell sitting here, how does a grid security emergency work with a Stafford Act disaster declaration? Where are the ESF-12, will the ESF-12 resources have multiple bosses in these types of scenarios, right? So I say that in saying that, while hopefully we're working through these frameworks, it's a very telling story to me that nobody hardly ever raised their hand in here and has ever heard of a grid security emergency. We've got a lot of work to do, right? And that's the purpose of this. Hopefully we figure out solutions and sustainable energy in the future. But what are we doing right now today when attacks are coming? So Sean, let's start with you. You recently had an cyber exercise. You're working through the state with your energy providers on energy resilience. What does that look like in the state of Virginia? And what did you learn from your exercise? What we're talking about here?
It's an awesome question. And so folks, last month we actually partnered with a private sector owner-operator of a major electric provider in Virginia. It was a fantastic exercise. And really what we were doing is, number one, let's exercise our cyber response annex. Yeah, absolutely. Our base plan, the EOP, serves as a foundation for the all hazards approach to include cyber, right? So we recently published, and Amy Hoffman, if you're here, throw your hand up if you are. There she is right in the back. She led the development of that. And let me tell you, building consensus when you have law enforcement, IT professionals, and emergency managers, I think I built campaign combat plans easier than a cyber response annex, and I appreciate Amy's leadership getting that done. And it was just a lot of contentious issues, and so that was number one. Let's validate our response plan for a cyber-related event, and remember, we got to manage consequence, and maybe we'll talk about that. I think that's going to be the bigger challenge. And then number two, can we and how do we support a private sector partner? And folks, we broke it down. I mean, we're really good at supporting a city or locality, and they have WebEOC accounts and they submit resource requests. Well, what we found is, what if the entity requesting the support is private? Well, they need WebEOC accounts, or how are we going to deal with that? So we're sending them a liaison. So we went through this whole exercise. We looked at the legal issues surrounding states supporting a private sector. We looked at legal issues, and we actually simulated a deployment of National Guard cyber capabilities under state active duty. And we actually put soldiers and airmen on keyboard, energy provider infrastructure. And so the bottom line up front is, yes, if there's at least, you got to consult your state code. If there's consequence to the public, the state can provide support to private sector until they can certify that I can get help from another contractor, or maybe the event begins to stabilize. And now the other thing is, yes, the National Guard has huge cyber capability. Virginia is home of the 91st Cyber Command. 28 states they collaborate with, and every state has a cyber capability. If you don't know your cyber protection team, let me know, and I'll make sure you're connected. But under state active duty and potentially Title 32, we can deploy them, and they also can provide that support. And it's an incredible capability because of their experience, right? These are defensive cyber operators, but some of them have offensive, so they know the TTPs of getting into the system. So it was an incredible experience. And the last thing is that capability can be EMAC'd, right? And so now we can work with FEMA Region 3 or across the states and share this cyber capability. Now, there's a couple things we got to work on. Is it eligible under a Stafford Act reimbursement, cyber activities? Probably not. We got to figure that out. We have to be prepared to manage the consequence. A large energy sector grid failure is going to be a problem for us as emergency managers. And it was a great demonstration.
One of the areas that you bring up that also was highlighted by GridX 6 was the lack of continuity in communications for the energy sector. Right? So this is a huge problem that the energy sector is trying to solve, right? So there's all this talk about dark fiber networks and building billion-dollar capabilities so that all of the energy companies can actually talk together. And as the emergency manager leading this thing, I'm thinking, man, we've bought thousands of communications on wheels as emergency managers.
Yeah.
We've bought thousands, probably, of the multi-communications vehicles, which I affectionately call air conditioning units. That go to ball games on Saturday and go to county fairs and occasionally show up for the big disaster. The question there is should we rework all of the communications on wheels? If energy is the most important infrastructure to turn back on, why would we not be able to push our communications capabilities with tactical interoperable plans, to a private energy provider or fuel provider to help them speak and talk to whoever it is they need to talk to, from the Department of Energy to DOD to other power providers across the country? The question is, can we legally do that? And so I think that we have a lot to offer the energy companies on the private side, but the conversation's got to start now.
Absolutely. Yep. And remember, it's about breaking down barriers. We're in the relationship business, and everybody respects that, and I know that in the room. But again, you got to put that IT person next to the emergency manager, next to the communications specialists, and the private sector and the attorneys, and you got to break down those barriers.
You're right. All right, Mike, let's turn to you. So from your perspective, what do you want state emergency managers to know about your business at Green Mountain Power?
I think in Vermont, we actually have a pretty good open relationship. We're a small state, as I talked about earlier. We actually almost have no barriers between emergency management, Green Mountain Power, Vermont Transportation, VTrans. And prior to an event, I'm talking more physical infrastructure than cyber. Trust me, we have plans for cyber too. I don't even know how much I dare talk about. That's how it's treated at GMP. But in terms of physical assets, before severe weather or anything, even a cyber event even hits or we have wind of it, we actually have a statewide call that includes all the Vermont utilities, Vermont Emergency Management, regulators, everybody that's involved that's going to respond to this event. We're also pretty unique in well, maybe not unique with this crowd, but we do have an international border. And a lot of the times that we're hit, we're actually kind of at the far end of the northern end of things. So most of the help might be taken up already in southern New England. And a lot of the times we go to either help our neighbors in Canada or they come down to help us. And that's always a phone call away to Vermont Emergency Management, where we call at 11 at night, 2 in the morning, whatever. They're there to help, they're partners, and they help us get this done. So I think about the future, what we can do together more. We all know climate's going to continue to change, and I don't see this getting better. And I think where we can help each other more, and something we haven't really worked on, is a lot of the resiliency work we're working on. How can we get Vermont Emergency Management to help in those areas? They see where the issues are. They're often working with us. They know the towns, things like that. And I just wonder, combine transportation projects with energy projects, things like that, just more along that line. But it's a pretty open communication style right now, and I think it's going pretty well. We can always do more.
So the other lesson learned in GridX was more communication between emergency management and the power sector, but there was also an emphasis on training. So if you could train emergency managers, what would you want them to be trained on? One time we joke on occasion about ICS training, and the one thing we do is we have. It's been relatively quiet lately. I'm thankful for that, but we probably have 10 to 12 ICS events a year, and we've gotten pretty good at it, to the point where some of the trainings we actually haven't had because we just did the real thing 3 days ago. I do think if we can probably share more information there on what works, what doesn't. That's maybe one thing, just because we have so much experience actually implementing it. Outside of that, I'm not. They do pretty good at what they do. So
I think that the more that we can learn to speak the other's language, I think is really helpful, because you get into those situations, and I might not understand what's happening at my emergency management office, and they're surely not following global energy markets and supplies, which we are. And so how do you kind of share that information? And I think it's going to be continuous. The energy market and the energy dynamics are changing, every day. And so beginning to make sure that you're speaking the same language.
And follow up on that, Brock, but something we've learned working with the energy sector is they have incredible information sharing capacity. They operate at the classified cyber intel levels. They share between networks and other providers. And so you can lean on the energy providers that operate in your state for information. They have incredible capacity. And remember, they're monitoring the physical and cybersecurity of their entire network. So if you want to know what's going on in your state, hey, tell me, from a physical perspective and also a cyber, what's going on in my state and the network. And we've benefited greatly from that.
And I would think, too, that the time is prime now for there to be a joint emergency management energy training and influence on training. And the reason I say that is that most emergency managers, I learned about energy generation and transmission and restoration trial by fire, right, being in office. And while it's not the Federal Electricity Management Agency, we seem to be doing a lot of work in the electricity world when I was there. And, but the bottom line is that I do think there needs to be energy generation, transmission, and restoration training, like simple training for emergency managers, because the restoration piece is not easy. As you can explain, you don't just turn the plant back on and start pumping power down the lines, particularly if we do see big grids, start the cascading impacts from big grids, falling. And so there is a gap. The other thing, too, the grid security emergency, again, that doesn't apply to the fuel side. Where did we see one of the largest attacks in our country's private industry? Was a Colonial Pipeline, right? So technically, grid security emergency, as I understand it, doesn't apply to the fuel side. only the energy generation side.
Interesting.
And so, maybe there needs to be some amendments to the rules and to the laws. But, my question about that one is, from an emergency management standpoint, is how many days away were we from a massive humanitarian crisis when food doesn't show up at grocery stores and there's nowhere to get gas that impacts Texas to the Del Mar area? And so I do think that there's a big, push for training. Dan, real quick about what's going on, and not real quick, but, explain to us, how do you guys establish what energy resilience looks like in Maine? And also, what would you like an emergency manager to know, too, about how they can help you?
Yeah, so I think if you're not aware, every state has now submitted a state energy security plan. Hopefully y'all are familiar with it and have reviewed it and talked to your state energy office. If not, please call them. In order to be eligible for some of the federal infrastructure money, they had to have submitted a state energy security plan within the last couple of months. In Maine, we hadn't updated our energy assurance plan since 2012. And starting in 2018, 2019, I'm looking over at Joe from our Maine team, we realized that was not good enough. And so we came together with our emergency management and the state energy office to host multiple convenings of the energy industry and helped rewrite that plan. And so we were required to submit our updated plan 2 months ago. We had already basically done the updates and done the plan. So that convening, bringing folks together. And I'll just say, to your point about the fuel side, that's something we're in constant communication with the industry about. I was just talking to Joe and his boss about, we're having kerosene heating shortages in Maine right now, and we're trying to deal with that and then understand what the knock-on impacts. So there are kind of acute weather events that we're going to be prepared for and deal with and be ready for, but then also some of these market and supply issues that we're coming into, especially this winter, that we need to have those open lines of communication.
So what's the difference between a state energy office and private power providers, generation? Explain that relationship.
Yeah, so the state energy office is is going to be your policy office. I'm in the governor's office. Some offices are their own department. Some are within the economic development office, but every state has an energy official or designated energy director. We serve typically in that ESF 12 role. We also work with the Department of Energy's CSER office focused on cybersecurity and resiliency. And so these electric utilities are regulated by a utility commission of some sort, and then they're the private entity. So we play less of a regulatory role, but more of a policy and convening role.
And what's NASIO?
NASIO is the National Association of State Energy Officials, so this version for state energy officials.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. So the other thing that's pretty interesting, too, is that there is so much money coming down from the federal government right now. I think a lot of people look like deer in headlights. We're not sure what we're entitled to, how to sequence all the money to ultimately use it to become more resilient. Particularly on the energy side, I think it's $28 billion potentially coming down in IIJA. How do you prepare for that funding?
Yeah, so a lot of that is going directly through the energy office. There's something like $5 billion coming over the next 5 years for grid resiliency. And so those plans are due to be submitted to DOE. It was supposed to be September, now it's March. So in Maine, we're hosting public engagement sessions. We're talking directly to our utilities. We're looking at opportunities from, the language is pretty broad. It can be from vegetation management to microgrids, right? And so we're putting together our 5-year plan for submission. That's just what the state energy office is eligible for. The private sector is eligible for another $5 billion. Then there are joint opportunities. So there's it's called the Building a Better Grid initiative, and every state energy office is trying to figure out how to spend that effectively. And we are going through our own public process in coordination with emergency.
And if I remember correctly, there's $200,000 for state energy resilience plans that emergency managers or offices can take to build a baseline plan, and then that opens up the door for more mitigation funding as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, we submitted our initial plans, and then everyone has agreed that we'll need to continue updating those over the next year or so in coordination with the emergency management.
I do think there's opportunity there with the funds that are becoming available for emergency management teams in each state to have more of an input on where that might go. I think we empower our crews to come up with what's going to make us more resilient. They're out there every day, right, working the lines. And I also think that emergency management teams are also working with each state's power providers, electricity providers, and I think they have a lot of insight as to where a lot of the troubles often are. In Vermont, we don't normally face hurricanes. We had a terrible one in Tropical Storm Irene, but a lot of it is incredibly far out rural areas when we get 3 feet of heavy wet snow. And I can probably look at anyone in Vermont Emergency Management and they could probably tell me where the tough spots are. So I think, having the emergency management teams have input on possibly where some of those dollars should go, I think would be helpful as well.
Yeah, and you can see that, let's just look at the reliability metrics or the outage metrics, but you need to have that conversation so okay, is there a community center, a hospital here, a warming shelter here, and do they have backup power or do they not? And how does that's what we don't necessarily know that I think we could have more engagement on together.
And also, as a final note about the money that's coming down, I think there's like 15 potential line items in IIJA just for university research on energy resilience and planning too. So with all your state research facilities and different things too. Before we turn it over for questions, final thoughts.
This is a problem you cannot wish away. We are crisis leaders, and so we need to step up as emergency management professionals and grab those IT folks, grab those energy sector folks and other critical infrastructure, and law enforcement and all the other folks, CISA, and say, hey folks, we have a strategy in dealing with crisis. Let's leverage those systems and processes. Let's have our plan, but let's exercise and figure out where we need to invest and develop those strong relationships. And remember, it's not just the cyber event. You got to manage the consequences at the same time.
I think there's incredible opportunity to continue to work together as a team. We embed people right in the emergency operations centers at Vermont Emergency Management so that if the state has questions, Vermont Emergency Management has questions, we have somebody right there that can quickly get an answer and you're not searching out people. And that works in both directions too. We will often call and say, hey, we're in really rough shape in this town. You might want to think about opening a shelter. For those that don't know Vermonters, they barely ever go. They're pretty hardy, but at least the thought is there to be able to have an emergency shelter if needed. So I do think if people don't do those things where they actually embed people within each other's areas, I think that can be incredibly helpful and something that we should do more of in the future.
And I would just say I think that there's a great deal of federal technical resources available on the energy side, and I think that energy offices have a good connections with the Department of Energy to get those and to work together with emergency management folks. And I haven't talked about the state activity around resiliency planning and focused on climate change, but I think you'll find a lot of your state energy offices are doing that, and so working on those together. We're funding technical resources for communities and regions, and want to make sure that we're doing that together.
Yeah. To wrap up and then we'll go to questions, again, I think with all the money that's out there, there has never been a more extraordinary time to accomplish your goals as a community leader or as a state director. I really think that it is wise of you to sit down with your finance departments, your budget offices, and get some help in to map the money across. There's $25 billion in transportation coming down the pipe in IIJA. There's so much money in the mitigation arena between FEMA and HUD and post-disaster, pre-disaster, BRIC funding, whatever it may be. How do you start to line up your goals with all the funding that's there and realistically grab what you're entitled to, but what makes sense to also achieve your goals? There's never been a better time, so sit down and do that. And I think that we ought to be doing that in the energy arena. And again, emergency management, your life gets easier when the power comes back on and the fuel flows. It cuts down the need for you to get involved in the humanitarian side of the house. And I also think that you really need to, sit down and focus on your response tactics in the first initial 72 to 120 hours. Like I said, I'm not being hard on debris contractors by any means. These guys provide tremendous services and much needed, but let's be thoughtful about making sure that we're not creating a problem when we think we're opening up roadways, those types of things. Understand the grid security emergency. There's a lot to that I think that emergency management needs to really understand what their role is and how you're going to be able to impact restoration priorities or how you're going to get information about it, but more importantly on the continuity of communications. If I were you, If I'm sitting in your seat, I'm learning how to use all those vehicles to help, the energy companies learn how to communicate, because right now they're using satellite phones. And that's not the answer. And, by the way, what's the phone number to your satellite phone?
That's right.
Is it even charged?
It doesn't work.
So keep those things in mind, and that's where we are. We talk about grid resiliency, and I hope we figure it out, and I hope we figure out a bright green future in the next 10, 20, 30 years. But right now, I think the focus needs to be on what are we doing today.
That's right.
All right, let's open it up for questions. Please use a mic, because the acoustics are tough in the back. There's got to be some questions or some thoughts.
Thanks, Bob. Hey, I heard you mention an issue with kerosene.
Yeah.
I got a call last week from a local emergency manager from Rhode Island. Asked for what's that?
Microphone? Get your mic. Yeah.
I'm asking about kerosene. One of my local emergency managers called, said he was having trouble finding kerosene. I hadn't heard that before, so could you elaborate on the issue you're coming across? Is it short-term, long-term? What's the issue?
Yeah, sure. So we should talk offline a little bit too. But the general issue is that for kerosene or K1 being used particularly for heating or as a kind of maybe mixed with diesel, so it's not freezing during extreme temperatures. As we move from refineries producing gasoline to then moving to distillates or heating oil, obviously there's been jet fuel challenges, and they're pretty similar products. But just the supply coming into the States pre-winter, I think, has been a little bit delayed if you didn't have a contract. And so I think that's what we're working through is maybe some of these cash dealer or cash customers who tend to be potentially lower income or not signed up, and so working through that with the states. I'd be happy to talk to you more.
Thank you.
Can we follow on to that for a minute? Because that, Mark, we got the same thing in Maryland, and it was a covert telephone call from our energy folks saying there's no kerosene. That's a serious situation, as you just described it. Why is this being handled so silently? And why is emergency management not? Now, we were pulled in quickly, notified, but told not to tell anybody. It's
classified.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I got a secret and you're going to die, but that's okay. We can't live like that.
Yeah.
And why is that happening? Is that, I'll be blunt, private sector concern because whatever? Is that ultimately nationwide panic concern? We can deal with problems when we know what the problem is and we put it on the table and we talk about it. But the covert end of it has got to stop.
I mean, I can only speak for Maine. That we've been in communication with deputy director and director in Maine, and we worked through those issues. I think one challenge is it's an unregulated. Electricity is regulated, right? You've got a utility commission regulating a utility. The delivered fuels market is not, and so there's not always you get EIA information about fuel supplies, but it's a little bit challenging. But I think this is the exact reason we need to be kind of around the table.
Tough side of the private energy side is that they have investors too.
Yeah, that's huge too. That's huge. And Russ, you're hitting the nail on the head. You'll never have a perfect relationship with a private sector partner. Our energy provider that we were working with, they admitted the same. Their attorneys were in the room during the exercise, and they reckon, hey, they have to protect their interests, and there will be lawsuits. And so you and I are going to have to recognize that, figure it out, and then have a backup plan. I mean, we have to recognize that limitation. They have their equities that they have to protect and interests that if you look at Colonial Pipeline, restoration, they were always way ahead of schedule because they had a plan to under-deliver or, over-deliver, under-promise, and because they're trying to manage information. And so you couldn't get anything out of Colonial in figuring out what's going on and how much fuel. And that's a perfect example of they're going to have to protect their interests too.
Well, I've had the opportunity to have some experience specifically with Colonial Pipeline through TSA Pipeline while I was at another entity and doing a study, but you're exactly right. And one of the things which I think is good discussion here, I do have a good relationship with our energy agency.
Right.
And we also have a commission, so somehow or another we got to keep the two of them kind of together and feeding in our energy SCF for us. But one of the things that I think is important for everyone to understand too is you mentioned NASO. Am I saying that right?
NASIO.
NASIO.
Yep.
But NASIO with NGA had the event with the energy folks, and our energy folks are back on the phone with us while they're there asking questions and clarification and all. I do think it's a good challenge for NEMA to energize a little bit more, no pun intended, energize a little bit more with NGA and what they're doing in pockets, that we might be able to collectively get together. And we have some, there's just some organizational things there that are different, but we do need to get everybody kind of together on all of that. So we commend you and appreciate what your comments are.
I think you would be provided visibility if you sign up to be a member with the EISAC on their information sharing under the NERC. And maybe, Trina, we can work with you to get the information on how somebody would register with NERC or EISAC to be able to start getting their bulletins and information.
And from a realistic perspective, too, we've got the states and the territories here who each one of us are each one of us. And we have limited staff. And the reality is we've really got to get deep into coordinating and placing the responsibility on the ESF or the SCF to be on top of these kind of things. And if anything, we, emergency manager, are a good supervisor walking around with a cup of coffee saying, I need to see that by 4 o'clock, kind of thing, because it's the all hazards environment we're in today, we can't keep up with.
Question?
Thank you for the panel. Really enjoying it. So my name is Bear Afghami. I'm an emergency manager with Impact Strategic Consulting. So yes, my name is actually Bear. If anyone asks you if you saw any bears in Vermont, you can just say yes. I've been researching this issue for 2 months. I'm not an electrical engineer, no experience, just an emergency manager. And the more I learn, way more questions I have. So one thing I actually learned right now is that we still use kerosene, and that was not even on my radar. I have a million questions, but I'll just narrow it down to 2. One for Sean. When you did your exercise, cybersecurity exercise, Dominion Energy was attacked. Who was in charge? IT, the EOC, who was incident command?
Great question.
And then, the second one is kind of a reiteration. Brock, you already covered it kind of. But if Mike came to me as an emergency manager and said, what kind of training can I take in emergency management? I'd say go to FEMA, independent study any time of day. There really is no source for us to even learn what grid resiliency entails. So if, any of these organizations that are in charge now can come up with that kind of training for us, I think that would be very beneficial.
Yeah, awesome question. That always comes up. So bottom line, our legal analysis revealed, and we think this is the right strategy, that since that private sector energy provider owns that network, they know the network, it's almost like the locality. Like we exist to support our localities. They know the folks that live there and the challenges they face much better than we do at the state level. So we exist to support them. So in that scenario, the energy provider is the supported entity. So they're the ones generating the resource requests. They're certifying that I can't get a resource request from anywhere else other than the state. And once they certify that, and there's impacts on the public, then our EOC can activate. The governor can declare a state of emergency, and we support. In this case, it was Dominion. And but isn't that interesting? That's the same strategy we do every day, right? I mean, when we have a wind or rain come through a state, we take chainsaw teams and put it with the electric utility, crews, right? It's the same thing. So it's really interesting that you just got to open it up and not shy away from the cyber question, right? And then also on the legal side is there will be a couple challenges. Pre-coordination with the energy providers in your state is essential, because you want to look at non-disclosure agreements. In the IT world, that is standard of care. Like that, everybody does an NDA when I'm working on your system because you're going to see things that are proprietary or the like. So you need to have those legal questions answered before the event, and that also will protect the state and the entity itself. So hopefully that made sense. And great question, though.
I'd like to see the energy restoration for dummies training.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean,
yeah.
And I say that, here's the deal is when I went through the experience with Maria and others that have gone through the experience with the ERCOT system in Texas and everything else, there is no real playbook for the emergency manager. You get handed this bag. And, Administrator Criswell's best option is the Army Corps of Engineers.
Yeah.
Right? And DOE and ESF 11 is not going to swoop out of some helicopter and tell you how to start rebuilding your grid. And I think that at the local level to the state level, on the restoration side, it's got to be how is energy or fuel restored, but then what are the tactics that you can provide, like waivers or communications or whatever it may be.
Yep.
To the public and private energy providers, and there are public and private providers when it comes to energy generation and all of the different associations. We've got to start a baseline training in that direction.
Brock, can I? So when you asked about electric resiliency, you made me think of, we actually have a climate plan that we've presented to the state of Vermont, and we've gone around to stakeholders, customers, state legislators all around the state, and we've laid that plan out and what it means. And as we've done that, we've talked about this is the main backbone for the town. These are the extremities that go out to the rural areas. And we're talking about how we want to become more resilient in each area. Like we're talking about underground. That never used to be talked about. We've learned how to get underground in the ground for a comparable price to the overhead. And we're trying to get everyone to yes on that, including people that have been in the industry for years that's new to, right? So I think there's opportunity there that when we're talking about resiliency, we can also talk about how to restore a grid, things like that. So that's something to think about with your energy providers around the country.
Just in Maine, we just passed legislation requiring a 10-year climate plan for our utilities for the first time. So,
question about it?
Is this working? Oh, good. More of a observation that maybe could be helpful to some of my state partners coming from Utah here. But something I was just a part of was an international grid resiliency conference and speaking on a panel for it. And they brought me in to look at more of the wildfire piece of grid resiliency. But just for a good partnership, so through our university, so I would say reach out to your local universities and see possibly what they have for us. It was University of Utah, and they were sponsoring this international conference. But I found so many great partnerships there that really could help my state from every sector of energy. And so I would just say that's a good place to possibly start. And if you're interested, and I give you more information.
All right. Yes, sir.
Y'all have touched on this a little bit, but I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about it. I believe most people in America receive their electricity from an investor-owned utility, and of course, those entities aren't eligible for public assistance. I'm interested just from a management standpoint in the response and recovery process. What types of difficulties do you encounter on the ground because they're effectively outside of the program?
So there are two different types. There's public and, privately owned. The American Public Power Association is typically an association that deals, I think there's over 2,000 public power providers. They're typically in smaller municipalities, which would technically be eligible for uninsured losses and different things that get you that automatic declaration when they lose their grid, right? But then on the private side, it's tough. And should the federal government be paying for private industry to come back up online? I mean, we could debate that all day. But
it's a really interesting question. It did come up during our exercise, and we're trying to figure out. I'm glad the administrator's here because, So cyber activities are not Stafford Act. So if the costs for a cyber protection team or some team protecting state systems or locality or providing a cyber service, that's going to have to be currently, we believe, borne on the state. So the state would have to pay for it. But the consequence, right? Hey, we need to move fuel around. We need trucks from the National Guard to set up a points of distribution. Those are eligible activities, but will that be a Stafford Act event? That's one question that still remains, right? If we have an electric grid, you could argue that's an act of terrorism, so there are questions we do need to answer. And then if you distill it down further and get into the weeds, if we're supporting a private sector partner, we're fairly certain, at least our analysis is, we're going to have to bill them for that service. And so the good news is our resources are a lot cheaper than some of the other cyber assets that are available across the globe. But I think that would probably be the right thing to do is we're going to have to, hey, we can give you that support, but here's a bill on the back end. And oh, by the way, there's going to be a disengagement criteria. Once their systems are coming back up, the states have a responsibility to say, hey, we're going to withdraw their support because you've either fixed the problem or you're now caught up and the crisis phase of restoration is now over. But don't forget, again, sending the National Guard over to help Dominion was the easy part of the exercise. The hard part is, what do I do with half the state of Virginia with no electricity? That's where the EOC is busy.
The other area where emergency management comes into play is like if you look at what's going on in Florida. I mean, thousands of crews are coming down there. God forbid we have another one somewhere else because all the power crews are in Florida. But the bottom line is that where the state gets involved is providing waivers and then trying to figure out how to stage thousands of trucks and where you're putting these camps. And that's a public-private sector partnership that's got to take place, pre-event contracts and rules put into place that can be waived at any time. So you're seeing that actually take place where it's working pretty well.
We recently had crews in Nova Scotia and Florida, and they're all home now, we're happy to say. So,
all right, Trina, we got 3 minutes, right? Is that right? All right, last question. Bob Fenton.
Yeah, where's he?
You want it? No? Come on, last question. Somebody ask a good one. Here we go. All right.
I'll jump in. One, to really complement the utility crews and all, because they are extremely well organized and they can mobilize quickly. And in the mid-Atlantic area, there's the All Hazards Consortium, which has really reached out and tried to pull all of them together. So I think that's an area, too, that we should explore a little bit more, and how can we expand that to other areas of the nation.
Yep.
So we're part of a mutual assistance group that actually goes all the way down into Virginia.
Yep.
We're part of the North Atlantic Mutual Aid Group, and we work closely with the SEE, which is the Southeastern Exchange. And Canada is actually part of that. And we do, the All Hazards works with all those teams. So we get all the information. They've been working on the border crossings for us, fuel issues, things like that. But we do have a pretty robust mutual assistance program. And when I think about if it becomes a national response event, how do you break that system down and have one taken over by another entity? So that's something we think about a lot, and I think we do fine, but it's not anything we've ever done yet. So.
All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you for all the good questions. If you have a big grid security failure, good luck. And we'll see you in
on the other
Alexandria.
side.
Right.